Hello again. You may recall a previous video we did of David Barron's book, The Visions and Prophecies of Zechariah, published around the time that the Watchtower was putting out The Finnish Mystery and Millions Now Living Will Never Die. Well, David Barron was a contemporary of Charles Russell and Joseph Rutherford, and therefore he forms a suitable comparison when we're trying to evaluate whether or not the spiritual food that Jehovah's people on earth, according to Watchtower propaganda today, the food they were being fed at the time, the 1910s and 20s, what was their food like, and what was the food that was being fed in Christendom like? Well, David Barron has profited me much, and by the way, his books are still in print. Some 100 years later, this is another book he wrote in the 1920s, 1922 this one came out, and you can see by the title, he beat the Watchtower to the punch. His book is titled The Servant of Jehovah, and Jehovah's Witnesses didn't take that name until about 9 years later. Of course, the name Jehovah was well known in Christendom before, but this book had special punch in 1922 because it was written by a converted Jew, a Jew converted to Christianity earlier in his life, and by now turning his full time to talking about messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. That was David Barron's specialty. And in this book, he deals specifically with the greatest of all messianic prophecies, Isaiah 52, 53, the Servant of Jehovah. The subtitle is the sufferings of the Messiah and the glory that should follow. Now, he talks about the reason he wrote this specific book and the blessings he received while researching and meditating upon Isaiah 52 and 53 himself in order to write this book for us. And this is how he expresses his appreciation of the book and his hope for us in assessing its points. He says, though sensible of the shortcomings and imperfection of my effort, I have the heart assurance that there is a blessing in it. And if the reader receives only a fraction of the spiritual help and enjoyment which the writer found in the course of his meditation and exposition of this truly wonderful scripture, he will be amply rewarded. It has confirmed his faith in the supernatural character of prophecy and made him feel as never before that Holy Scripture has upon it the stamp of its divine author, the mark of heaven, the impress of eternity. It has, if possible, wrought deeper conviction in his heart that Jesus of Nazareth is indeed the Christ, the promised Redeemer of Israel, he of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write. For it is beyond even the wildest credulity to believe that the resemblance in every feature and minutest detail between this prophetic portraiture drawn centuries before his advent and the story of his life and death and glorious resurrection as narrated in the Gospels can be a mere accident or fortuitous coincidence. It has also strengthened my hope in the future blessing of the nation from which I have sprung, for which I have not ceased to yearn with the yearnings of him who wept over Jerusalem and even on the cross prayed for them, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. For in the words of Franz Delitzsch, we must not overlook the fact that this golden passional is also one of the greatest prophecies of the future conversion of the nation, which has rejected the servant of God and allowed the Gentiles to be first to recognize him. At last, though very late, it, that is the nation of Israel, will feel remorse. And when this shall once take place, then, not till then, will this chapter, which to use an old epithet, will ever be carnificina rabbinorum, receive its complete historical fulfillment. I believe that phrase in Latin means something along the lines of the curse of the rabbis, or the ruin of the rabbis, because what Delitzsch is saying, and by the way, Delitzsch, who he quotes here, is also a converted Jew, about 2 generations before Barron, in the middle of the Victorian era. Franz Delitzsch is saying here, and obviously Barron believes this too, that the reason this passage, Isaiah 52 through 53, is even ignored in synagogue services in recent centuries is because it is such a clear depiction of one who they cannot reinterpret the passage successfully without referring, of course, to the Christian claims about this chapter. There is no, therefore, backdoor for Israel or for the rabbis in dealing with this chapter, because even Jews who read it but once, say it's somehow a Christian writing snuck into the Old Testament. So when you actually reveal to them that it's in the Old Testament, not the New Testament, they are often surprised. So Barron, like many Jews, believes we should use this passage in dialogue with unbelief. If it can conquer Jewish unbelief, think of the uses we can put it to with others who don't have so deep a prejudice as the Jewish people do. Then he talks about the structure of the book of Isaiah in general. He notes that there's a miracle, a providential miracle, even in the English Bible, because as a Jew, of course, speaking and reading Hebrew in the synagogue, there are no chapters or verses. In the English Bibles, of course, in Bibles of Christian use in the last few centuries, there are chapters and verses, and Barron marvels at the structure of the portion of Isaiah usually called Second Isaiah, though that is the chapters from 40 to 66, 27 chapters in all, and you'll see immediately a correspondence, number of chapters to the number of books in the Christian Greek or New Testament. Now he talks about the structure. He says this: the second half of the book of Isaiah, consisting of the last 27 chapters, is the sublimest and richest portion of Old Testament revelation. It forms a single continuous prophecy, which occupies the same position in the prophetic scriptures as the book of Deuteronomy in the Pentateuch and the Gospel of John in relation to the Synoptic Gospels. It may be called the prophetic messianic epic of the Old Testament. It is sublime in its very style and language, and wonderful in its comprehensiveness, anticipating as it does the whole order of the New Testament. It begins where the New Testament begins, with the ministry of John the Baptist, the voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord. And it ends where the New Testament ends, with the new heavens and a new earth, wherein shall dwell righteousness. I'm referring here to chapters 40 and 66 in the second part of Isaiah. On examining the glorious prophecy closely, we find that the 27 chapters range themselves into 3 equal divisions of 9 chapters each, all ending with nearly the same solemn refrain: there is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked. So that's structural oddity, accident, or providential accident. Barron marvels at, even in the English Bible. And he goes on: the heart and climax of the whole prophecy is to be found in the brief section which forms its inmost center. That's chapters 52:13 to 53:12, which, instead of a prophecy uttered centuries in advance, reads like a historic summary of the gospel narrative of the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow. Taking our position at this central point, that is 53, we are almost overwhelmed with the evidence of design in the very structure of this prophecy. For on closer examination, we find that each book is subdivided into 3 sections of 3 chapters each, nearly corresponding to the divisions in the Authorized Version. Thus, the middle book is chapters 49 to 57. The middle section of the middle book is chapters 52, 53, and 54. And chapter 53 is the middle chapter of the middle section of the middle book, forming, as it were, the heart and center of this wonderful messianic poem, as well as the heart and center of all Old Testament prophecy. The central verse of this central paragraph, which begins properly with chapter 52:13, is, he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement with a view to our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And Barron concludes this first chapter with this paragraph: The doctrine it enshrines, namely substitution, is one of the leading truths unfolded in Old and New Testaments, and it forms the central thought in this great prophecy. It is, moreover, the essence of the message of comfort with which the prophet begins in chapter 40, verses 1 and 2, solving the problem as to how her iniquity is pardoned. Remember, he's referring to the opening message of chapter 40, where it says, "Comfort, comfort my people, because her iniquity is pardoned." If you can acquire the books of David Barron, many of them might be secondhand now, this is a great one, as indeed was the visions and prophecies of Zechariah. As a writer on messianic prophecy, there's no better. David Barron, the Servant of Jehovah.